The crystal champagne flute slipped from my fingers, shattering against the Italian marble floor with a sound that silenced the entire ballroom. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me, but I only saw one face, my husband Richard's, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to something far more dangerous as he read the document I'd just handed him. "What do you mean the company is in your name?" His whisper carried the weight of an avalanche about to break loose. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Mitchell, and until 6 months ago, I was what everyone in Chicago's North Shore social circuit called a trophy wife. The label followed me through charity galas, country club luncheons, and art gallery openings like expensive perfume, invisible but ever present. At 52, with carefully maintained blonde highlights and a wardrobe full of designer labels my husband insisted I wear, I had perfected the role that everyone expected me to play. The lakefront view from our Belmont Heights mansion stretched endlessly before me as I stood in my walk-in closet that morning, selecting an outfit for another ladies' auxiliary meeting at the Meridian Club. My fingers brushed past the Chanel, suits, and Valentino dresses, each one chosen by Richard or his personal shopper, to ensure I looked the part of a tech CEO's wife. "Remember, Elena," he'd say, adjusting my pearl necklace before events, "you represent Mitchell Technologies wherever you go. Image is everything." 28 years of marriage had taught me to nod and smile at such comments, to accept the role I'd been assigned in our carefully choreographed life. The photo on my vanity captured us at last year's Tech Innovation Awards. Richard in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, me in a gold Versace gown he'd selected, both of us radiating success. To the outside world, we were the perfect power couple. Behind closed doors, I had become an accessory, as carefully curated as the modern art pieces that decorated our walls. I hadn't always been this woman. Before I became Mrs. Richard Mitchell, I was Elena Kovac, daughter of Croatian immigrants who had built their American dream one sacrifice at a time. My father drove trucks across the country while my mother cleaned office buildings at night. Both of them determined that their children would have the education they never could. Their calloused hands and tired eyes pushed me through Northwestern University's business school, where I graduated summa cum laude with a focus on corporate finance and emerging technologies. The irony wasn't lost on me as I fastened the diamond, tennis bracelet Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary, the same year he'd started calling me his beautiful distraction at board meetings. The girl who had worked 3 jobs to pay for textbooks, who had spent countless nights in the library studying market trends and coding languages, had somehow been reduced to a decorative element in her own life story. I met Richard during my final semester at Northwestern. He was a guest lecturer in my advanced corporate strategy class, already making waves in the tech industry with his innovative approaches to data analytics. 10 years my senior, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going in life. After his lecture on disruptive innovation, I approached him with questions about his presentation, particularly his overlooked analysis of emerging market vulnerabilities. "You actually understood all that?" he'd asked, genuinely surprised. Most students' eyes glaze over when I get into the technical details. "Understanding it isn't the challenge," I'd replied. "The real question is why you're not considering the long-term implications of data sovereignty in your expansion model." That conversation led to coffee, which led to dinner, which led to a whirlwind romance that had my immigrant parents both thrilled and concerned. Richard represented everything they'd dreamed for me: success, security, sophistication. But my mother had pulled me aside before the wedding. "Elena, moja draga," she'd whispered in her thick accent, "never forget who you are beneath the fancy dresses. A woman who forgets her own strength becomes weak." The early years of our marriage were a partnership in every sense. I worked alongside Richard as he built Mitchell Technologies from a small startup into a major player in the data analytics industry. While he focused on the big picture and client relationships, I handled the intricate details, the coding frameworks, the financial projections, the patent applications. We would work late into the night in our tiny apartment, eating takeout, while debugging code or revising business proposals. "You're brilliant," he would say, watching me solve complex algorithms. My secret weapon. But as the company grew and success arrived, our dynamic shifted imperceptibly. The transition was gradual, like gaining weight. You don't notice the daily changes until one day your clothes no longer fit. Richard hired professional teams to handle the technical aspects I once managed. Board meetings became boys' clubs, where my presence was tolerated rather than valued. The home office we once shared became his private domain. "You've done enough, darling," he said when I questioned my diminishing role. "It's time to enjoy the fruits of our labor. Why don't you focus on making our home beautiful? Join some committees. That's what successful wives do." The word wives stung, not partners, not co-founders, just wives. But I adapted, as women often do. I channeled my energy into our home, our children, our social standing. I became the hostess everyone envied, the mother who never missed a school event, the committee chair who raised record funds for charity. I convinced myself this was evolution, not erasure. Sophie and Lucas grew up seeing their mother as Richard presented me. Beautiful, cultured, but ultimately decorative. At dinner parties, he would regale guests with stories of the company's early days, somehow omitting my contributions or reducing them to, "Elena kept me fed while I worked." The children would laugh along, never knowing their mother had written the original code that became the foundation of their father's empire. "Mom, why don't you ever talk about your work?" Sophie asked once during her senior year of high school. "Your mother's work is taking care of us," Richard interjected before I could answer. "She's the heart of our home." Sophie had nodded, satisfied with the explanation, while something inside me cracked a little more. The degrees hanging in our home office, my MBA, my computer science certificates, had been moved to the guest room during a renovation and never rehung. "They clash with the new design scheme," Richard had explained. I didn't argue. I had learned by then that some battles weren't worth fighting, or so I thought. The final shift in our relationship came when Richard took Mitchell Technologies public 5 years ago. The IPO was a massive success, making us wealthier than my immigrant parents could have ever imagined. But with the public offering came increased scrutiny, media attention, and a more polished corporate image. Richard hired a public relations firm to manage our family's profile, and they were very clear about the narrative they wanted to project. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're what we call an aspirational figure," the PR executive explained. "Beautiful, philanthropic, supportive. The public doesn't need to know about your technical background. It might confuse the story. Richard is the visionary genius. You're the woman who creates the perfect home for genius to flourish." I remember sitting in that meeting, manicured nails digging into my palms as they systematically erased my professional identity. Richard nodded along, occasionally reaching over to pat my hand as if to say, "This is for the best." When I tried to object later in private, he dismissed my concerns with practiced condescension. "Elena, sweetie, you have to understand how the game is played now. Nobody wants complexity. They want simple stories. I'm the tech genius. You're the beautiful wife who hosts amazing parties. It's not about truth. It's about perception." "But it's not who I am," I protested. "It's who you need to be now," he replied firmly. "For the company, for our family. Don't make this difficult." So I played the part. I appeared in the society pages wearing the right designers, supporting the right causes, saying the right things. I learned to deflect questions about my education with practiced grace. "Oh, that was so long ago," I would laugh. These days, I'm focused on my real passion, supporting Richard and giving back to our community. Inside, I was screaming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transformation was so complete that even our children began to see me differently. Lucas once brought home a friend who was struggling with calculus. When I offered to help, my son laughed. "Mom doesn't do math," he told his friend. "She does lunch." The casual dismissal from my own child cut deeper than any of Richard's calculated diminishments. But the universe has a strange way of balancing scales. 3 months ago, I received a call from James Chen, my former professor and mentor from Northwestern. He was organizing an alumni event focused on women in technology and wanted me to speak about my journey. "Elena Mitchell," he said, using my maiden name. "You were one of my most brilliant students. I've followed Mitchell Technology's success. I know you were instrumental in its early development." "I appreciate the invitation, Dr. Chen, but I haven't been involved in the technical side for years." "That's exactly why you should speak," he insisted. "Your story, how you transitioned from technologist to philanthropist, it's important. And between you and me, I remember who wrote the initial algorithms that became Mitchell Tech's core product." The conversation awakened something I had buried deep. That night, unable to sleep, I went to the guest room and retrieved my old diplomas and certificates. Beneath them, I found a box of materials from the company's early days. Notebooks filled with my handwriting, business plans I had drafted, even the original incorporation documents. As I flipped through the papers, a document caught my eye. It was the initial company registration, dated 25 years ago. There, in fading ink, was something I had completely forgotten in the blur of success and social expectations. Mitchell Technologies, LLC, registered owner, Elena Mitchell. My heart stopped. In our rush to launch the company, Richard had been dealing with investor meetings while I handled the paperwork. We had used my name for the registration because Richard had credit issues from a failed previous venture. "We'll transfer it once we're stable," he had promised. But in the whirlwind of growth, marriage, and children, we had never formally transferred ownership. Legally, I owned Mitchell Technologies. The revelation should have empowered me, but instead, it terrified me. For weeks, I carried this knowledge like a live grenade, unsure what to do with it. I consulted quietly with Marcus Wright, an attorney, friend from my Northwestern days who specialized in corporate law. His assessment was definitive. The original registration had never been superseded. Despite the public offering, the underlying ownership structure remained intact through a complex series of holding companies. I was, legally speaking, the true owner of my husband's empire. I began observing Richard with new eyes, noticing details I had willfully ignored for years. The way he dismissed my opinions at dinner parties with a patronizing smile. How he introduced me as my beautiful wife, but never mentioned my education or early role in the company. The casual manner in which he made major business decisions without even pretending to consult me, despite my name being on the founding documents. "The Shanghai expansion is moving forward," he announced one evening over dinner. "We're committing $50 million to the new data center." "That's a significant investment," I ventured. "Have you considered the regulatory challenges with data? Storage in..." "Don't worry your pretty head about it," he cut me off, reaching for his wine. "The board has it handled. How was your art class today?" The dismissal was so practiced, so automatic, that I wondered if he even realized he was doing it anymore. To him, I had become part of the furniture, expensive, decorative, but ultimately voiceless in matters of substance. Victoria Hammond, Richard's business partner and the company's COO, was even more direct in her marginalization of me. At company events, she would physically position herself between Richard and me, as if I were some groupie trying to get too close to a celebrity. During a recent charity gala, I overheard her telling a group of investors, "Richard's wife? Oh, she's sweet. Throws a lovely dinner party, but business isn't really her world." The irony burned. Victoria had joined the company 15 years after I had written the code that became our flagship product. She had no idea that the algorithms she proudly presented to clients were based on my graduate thesis work. Richard had long ago rewritten history, presenting himself as the sole technical visionary behind Mitchell Technologies. But knowledge is power, and I finally had some. I began quietly documenting everything, not with any specific plan, but out of an instinct for self-preservation. I photographed the original incorporation papers, made copies of early patent applications showing my name as co-inventor, and even found old emails from the company's inception where Richard acknowledged my technical contributions. The turning point came during a family dinner 3 weeks ago. Sophie was home from college for spring break, excitedly discussing her computer science coursework. "I'm working on a machine learning project," she enthused. "It's similar to what Dad's company does with predictive analytics." "That's fascinating," I said. "The key is to ensure your training data is properly normalized. Have you considered using a—" Richard's laugh cut through my words. "Listen to your mother trying to talk tech," he said, shaking his head with amusement. "Honey, stick to what you know. Sophie, your old man's the one to ask about this stuff." Sophie looked at me with sympathy, the kind reserved for someone who had embarrassingly overstepped their competence. Lucas smirked, and something inside me finally snapped. Not visibly, I had learned to never show cracks in my perfectly maintained facade, but internally, a decision crystallized. That night, while Richard slept, I retrieved every document related to the company's founding from our home safe. I had maintained access to his passwords over the years, a detail he'd overlooked in his assumption of my technical incompetence. I spent hours photographing everything, creating a digital archive of the truth he had so carefully buried. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Chen, accepting his invitation to speak at the alumni event. The second was to Marcus Wright, asking him to prepare a comprehensive analysis of my legal position regarding Mitchell Technologies. "Elena," Marcus said after reviewing everything, "you're sitting on a powder keg. Richard has built his entire public persona on a fiction. When this comes out, and it will have to eventually, it's going to be explosive." "I don't want to destroy him," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "I just want to stop being erased." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Marcus replied gently. As I prepared for the Northwestern event, I found myself reclaiming parts of my identity I had buried. I retrieved my old technical journals, reviewed the evolution of the algorithms I had developed, and even started coding again, something I hadn't done in over a decade. The mental muscles were rusty but still there, like a dancer returning to the bar after years away. Richard noticed the change in my routine but misinterpreted it. "Planning another charity auction?" he asked one morning, seeing me at my laptop. "Something like that," I replied, not bothering to correct his assumption. The night before the alumni event, Richard was scheduled to be in New York for an investors meeting. He kissed me goodbye with the same absent-minded peck he'd perfected over the years, completely unaware that his carefully constructed narrative was about to unravel. "Don't wait up," he called as he headed for his waiting car. "These Wall Street guys like to drink late." I watched his car disappear down our tree-lined drive, then returned to my preparations. On my desk lay 2 speeches, one that maintained the fiction of my life, and one that told the truth. I still hadn't decided which one to deliver. The universe, however, has its own plans. That evening, as I was reviewing my notes, my phone rang. It was Richard's assistant, her voice shaken. "Mrs. Mitchell, there's been a development. The SEC has launched an investigation into Mitchell Technologies. They're questioning the ownership structure and early patent filings. Mr. Mitchell is asking for you to gather all founding documents and meet him at the lawyer's office first thing tomorrow morning." The powder keg Marcus had warned about was already lit. The question now was whether I would let Richard control the explosion, or if I would finally take charge of my own narrative. I looked at the 2 speeches on my desk, then picked up the one that told the truth. "Tell Richard I'll be there," I said, "and tell him to be prepared for a very interesting conversation." The next morning, I dressed with deliberate care, not in the soft pastels and pearls Richard preferred, but in a sharp black suit I had bought years ago and never worn, the kind of suit a CEO might wear to a board meeting. I retrieved the original company documents from my private safe deposit, box documents Richard didn't even know I had maintained. The law offices of Blackstone and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower. As the elevator climbed to the 50th floor, I thought about my mother's words on my wedding day. A woman who forgets her own strength becomes weak. For 28 years, I had allowed myself to forget. Today, I would remember. The conference room was already full when I arrived. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by Victoria and a phalanx of lawyers. His face was drawn, stress evident in the deep lines around his eyes. When he saw me, his expression shifted to relief. "Elena, thank God. Did you bring the documents?" I set my briefcase on the table with deliberate calm. "I brought everything," I said, taking a seat not beside him as expected, but at the opposite end of the table. "Including some documents you may have forgotten existed." "What's going on?" Victoria demanded. "We don't have time for games. The SEC is breathing down our necks." I opened my briefcase and removed a thick folder. "Before we proceed, I think everyone should understand exactly who owns Mitchell Technologies." Richard's relief morphed into confusion. "Elena, what are you talking about?" I slid the original incorporation documents across the polished table. Mitchell Technologies, LLC, registered owner, Elena Kovach. That would be me. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria snatched the documents, her face cycling through disbelief, comprehension, and fury. Richard remained frozen, his mouth slightly open as if words had failed him entirely. "This is ridiculous," Victoria finally sputtered. "These are ancient documents." "The company has been restructured multiple times since then." "Has it?" I produced another set of papers. "Because according to these holding company records, which were filed with the state, the original ownership structure was never formally dissolved. Every restructuring built upon the original foundation, with me as the underlying owner." Richard found his voice. "Elena, this is some kind of mistake. You know I founded this company." "Did you?" I asked quietly. "Or did we found it together? Tell me, Richard, who wrote the base code for our first product? Who developed the algorithms that are still at the core of our technology? Who filed the patent applications?" "You were helping out," he said weakly, "supporting me." "I was creating," I corrected, "while you were selling. And when success came, you rewrote history to make yourself the sole genius. I let you because I thought that's what a good wife did. I thought supporting you meant disappearing myself." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you claiming ownership of the company?" "I'm not claiming anything," I replied. "I'm stating a legal fact. I own this company. I have always owned this company. The question is what we're going to do about it." Richard's face had gone from pale to florid. "This is insane. Elena, you haven't been involved in the business for years. You host parties. You plan fundraisers. You can't just walk in here and what?" I interrupted. "Claim what's legally mine? Point out that the trophy wife you've been parading around actually holds your empire in her hands?" Victoria stood abruptly. "This is blackmail." "No," I said calmly. "Blackmail would be threatening to expose how you've been cooking the books on the Shanghai project. This is simply a reckoning." The room erupted. Lawyers began furiously consulting documents. Victoria was on her phone, presumably with board members. Richard sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Marcus Wright, who had quietly entered during the chaos, approached me. "You knew this moment was coming." I hoped it wouldn't, I admitted. But when the SEC investigation started, I knew the truth would surface eventually. Better to control the narrative than be buried by it. As the initial shock subsided, the room slowly came to order. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Jonathan Blackstone, addressed me directly. "Mrs. Mitchell, what exactly are your intentions?" I looked around the room, at the faces that had dismissed me for so long, at my husband who had turned me into an ornament, at the company I had helped build and then been erased from. "My intentions," I said slowly, "are to finally be seen for who I am, not who you all decided I should be." Richard's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "What do you want, Elena?" "The truth," I replied. "I want the truth acknowledged. I want my contributions recognized. And I want a seat at the table, not as your wife, but as the owner of this company." The negotiations that followed lasted well into the night. The SEC investigation, it turned out, had been triggered by discrepancies in early patent filings. Discrepancies that existed because Richard had retroactively removed my name from several key innovations. My documentation not only established my ownership, but also provided a clear paper trail that could resolve the SEC's concerns. "You hold all the cards," Marcus murmured to me during a break. "I always did," I replied. "I just forgot I was playing." By dawn, a preliminary agreement had been reached. I would retain ownership but allow the existing management structure to continue, with several crucial modifications. I would join the board as chairwoman. My contributions to the company's founding would be publicly acknowledged. And most importantly, the truth about Mitchell Technologies' origins would finally be told. Richard was the last to leave the conference room. He stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and pink. "When did you know?" he asked without turning around. "I've always known," I said. "I just chose to forget. We both did." He turned to face me, and for a moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. Brilliant, ambitious, but also vulnerable. I convinced myself it was better this way, that you preferred the easier life. "You convinced yourself of what was convenient," I corrected gently. "You turned me into what you needed me to be, not who I was." "And now?" "Now we tell the truth. All of it." The Northwestern alumni event took place the following week. I stood at the podium in the same auditorium where I had graduated nearly 3 decades ago. Dr. Chen introduced me not as Mrs. Richard Mitchell, but as Elena Mitchell, co-founder and owner of Mitchell Technologies. The speech I gave was neither of the ones I had originally prepared. Instead, I spoke from the heart about identity, about the subtle ways women are erased from their own stories, about the difference between supporting someone and disappearing yourself. For years, I believed that being a good wife meant becoming less so my husband could become more, I told the audience. I let myself be rewritten, edited down to a supporting character in my own life story. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and mine is this. I am not, and have never been, just a trophy wife. I am an engineer, an innovator, a builder of companies. I am the woman who wrote the code that launched an empire, even if the world forgot that fact. The applause that followed was thunderous, but what moved me most was seeing Sophie in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood who her mother really was. The public revelation sent shockwaves through Chicago's business community. The narrative of Richard Mitchell, solo tech genius, crumbled as the truth emerged. Some criticized my timing, suggesting I had been vindictive, but most recognized what had really happened. A woman reclaiming her erased identity. Richard and I remain married, though our relationship has fundamentally transformed. We're rebuilding on a foundation of truth rather than fiction. He's learning to see me as a partner again, not a possession. It's difficult work, undoing decades of careful myth-making, but necessary. Mitchell Technologies has thrived under its new leadership structure. With my technical knowledge finally acknowledged and utilized, we've innovated in ways that weren't possible when half the founding vision was suppressed. The company's origin story, once a carefully curated tale of male genius, is now told honestly, as a partnership between two brilliant minds that lost its way but found truth in crisis. At a recent industry conference, someone introduced me as Richard Mitchell's wife. Among other things, I replied with a smile. But if we're using titles, I prefer chairwoman and owner of Mitchell Technologies. The shock on their face was worth every difficult moment of the past year. I am no longer content to be defined by others' perceptions. I am Elena Mitchell, engineer, entrepreneur, mother, wife, and definitely not just a trophy. My mother, now in her 80s, visited last month. As we sat in my office, my real office at Mitchell Technologies headquarters, she held my hand and smiled. "You remembered who you are," she said in her accented English. "Strong women sometimes forget, but they always remember in time." I looked at my reflection in the office window, no longer seeing the carefully curated wife Richard had fashioned, but the woman I had always been underneath the designer dresses and charity luncheons. The truth hadn't just set me free, it had brought me home to myself. The crystal champagne flute may have shattered that night at the gala, but it was my silence that truly broke. And in that breaking, I found my voice again. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story with the headline, "Tech Empire's Hidden Truth. The woman behind Mitchell Technologies emerges from the shadows." The reporter had done her homework, interviewing former employees who remembered the early days when I worked alongside Richard, coding through the night while pregnant with Sophie. The article sparked a national conversation about how many other women had been written out of their own success stories. Richard struggled with the new dynamic more than he admitted publicly. At home, I would catch him staring at me across the dinner table as if seeing a stranger. "You planned this for months," he said one evening after the children had left. "You let me continue thinking you were..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Were what, Richard? Harmless? Decorative? Incapable?" I set down my wine glass carefully. "I didn't plan anything beyond protecting myself. The investigation forced my hand. Would you have preferred I let you face the SEC with incomplete records?" He had no answer for that. The truth was complicated. I had saved him from potential fraud charges by revealing documentation he didn't even know existed. Yet the same truth had shattered his carefully maintained self-image as the sole architect of his success. Victoria. Hammond resigned within a month of the revelation. Her departure was dressed up as a pursuit of new opportunities, but everyone knew the real reason. She couldn't adapt to a hierarchy where I wasn't just the CEO's wife to be maneuvered around. At board meetings, her replacement, Diane Chen, came with impeccable credentials and no preconceived notions about my role. "I've studied the early patents," Diane told me during our first one-on-one meeting. "Your algorithmic approach was years ahead of its time. Why did you step away from the technical side?" "I didn't step away," I corrected. "I was gradually pushed out. Board meetings scheduled during school events. Technical discussions moved to golf courses. My ideas repackaged as Richard's innovations. It happened so slowly, I almost didn't notice until I had been completely sidelined." Diane nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I'm interested in your technical vision for the company's future. The Shanghai project needs a complete overhaul." For the first time in 15 years, I found myself in a technical strategy session, my mind firing on all cylinders as we discussed cloud architecture and data sovereignty issues. The younger engineers initially seemed skeptical, the boss's wife playing at being technical, until I began outlining solutions to problems they'd been struggling with for months. "Where did you learn about quantum encryption protocols?" one young developer asked after I suggested an approach to their security challenges. I wrote my master's thesis on theoretical applications of quantum computing in 1995, I replied, before it was trendy. The room went silent. Someone pulled up my thesis online, and suddenly the trophy wife was being looked at with newfound respect. Word spread quickly through the company. Within weeks, engineers were seeking my input on complex problems, treating me not as Mrs. Mitchell, but as a technical resource. Sophie called from Stanford, where she was finishing her junior year. "Mom, my computer science professor mentioned you in class today. He said your early work on predictive modeling is still referenced in academic papers. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Would you have believed me?" I asked gently. "When was the last time you saw me as anything other than your father's wife?" The silence on the other end spoke volumes. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "I think we all just accepted Dad's version of everything. Including me," I admitted. "But that's changing now." The most significant change came when I decided to return to hands-on development work. I carved out time each week to work directly with our R&D team, rediscovering the joy of solving complex technical problems. The first time I checked in code, to our repository, the entire development team received a notification. E. Mitchell has committed changes to the core algorithm. Richard walked into my home office that evening to find me surrounded by monitors, code streaming across multiple screens. He stood in the doorway looking lost. "I haven't seen you like this in, I can't even remember how long." 20 years, I supplied without looking up. "Not since you hired real developers to replace me." He flinched at the accuracy of my timeline. "I thought I was doing you a favor, freeing you from the technical grind so you could enjoy our success." I finally turned to face him. "You were erasing me, Richard, piece by piece, year by year, until even our children thought I was just a pretty face who threw nice parties." "That's not. I never meant." He struggled for words. "I loved you. I still do." "You loved a version of me," I corrected. "One that made you feel bigger by being smaller. The question is whether you can love the real me, the complete me." The board meeting following the revelations was tense. Several members who had been Richard's golf buddies for years struggled to adjust to the new dynamic. They directed their reports to Richard out of habit until I pointedly cleared my throat. "Gentlemen," I said, tapping the original incorporation documents I now brought to every meeting, "I believe those reports should be addressed to the chair." Maxwell Sterling, our oldest board member, had the grace to look embarrassed. "Of course, Elena. Our apologies. Old habits." "Indeed," I agreed. "Let's establish new ones." The meeting agenda included a review of the Shanghai project, the same expansion Richard had dismissed my concerns about months earlier. As the project lead presented his report, the problems I had foreseen became glaringly apparent. Regulatory hurdles, data sovereignty issues, and cost overruns had plagued the initiative from the start. "Perhaps," I suggested when the presentation concluded, "we should have considered these challenges when they were first raised. I didn't need to mention who had raised them." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We're committed now. We need to find solutions." "Agreed," I said. "Which is why I've prepared an alternative approach." I distributed a comprehensive analysis I had worked on with Diane, outlining a strategy that addressed each problem while salvaging the investment already made. The room fell silent as board members reviewed the document. Technical solutions, regulatory navigation strategies, and cost recovery projections filled 20 pages of detailed planning. "This is exceptional work," Maxwell admitted. "How long have you been developing this?" "I started the analysis 6 months ago when the expansion was first proposed," I replied. "But my input wasn't deemed necessary at the time." The board voted unanimously to implement my solution. After the meeting, Richard lingered as others filed out. "You could have told me you were working on alternatives." "I tried," I reminded. Him. You told me not to worry my pretty head about it. The media attention following the Tribune article was overwhelming. Interview requests poured in from business publications, women's magazines, and tech blogs. I was selective, choosing platforms that would let me tell the complete story rather than sensationalize the conflict. My appearance on Bloomberg Technology became a watershed moment. The interviewer, Maria Santos, had done extensive research into the company's history. Mrs. Mitchell, the patent records show your name on 7 foundational technologies. Yet, for 2 decades, the public narrative credited your husband as the sole innovator. How does something like that happen? Gradually, I answered, and with my complicity. I convinced myself that supporting my husband meant dimming my own light. Every time I stayed quiet when he took credit for my ideas, every time I laughed, off being called just the wife, I participated in my own erasure. But you kept the documentation, Maria observed. Some would say you were planning for this moment. I kept the documentation because they were my achievements, I corrected. Even if no one else remembered them, I couldn't forget the nights. I spent solving problems that became the foundation of our success. I wasn't planning for revelation. I was preserving truth. The interview went viral. Preserving truth trended on social media for days. Women from various industries began sharing their own stories of professional erasure, of contributions minimized or credited to male colleagues, of being pushed into decorative roles despite technical competence. Linda Torres, my best friend, from Northwestern who had become a federal judge, called after watching the interview. "You've opened Pandora's box," she said with admiration, and it needed opening. "I just told my story," I protested. "Exactly. And in doing so, you've given permission for others to tell theirs." The ripple effects reached our home life in unexpected ways. Lucas, our 17-year-old, began asking questions about the company's early days, showing interest in technology for the first time. He found old photos of me pregnant with Sophie, working on a primitive computer setup in our first apartment. "You look so different," he observed. "Not just younger, but, I don't know, more alive?" "I was building something," I explained. "Creating, solving problems. That's when I feel most alive." "Why did you stop?" The simple honesty of the question gutted me. I let myself believe that being your mom and dad's wife meant giving up being myself. I was wrong. He hugged me then, something he hadn't done spontaneously in years. "I'm glad you remembered who you are." The transition wasn't without casualties. Several longtime clients, uncomfortable with the shifting narrative, threatened to take their business elsewhere. Richard's ego took months to recover from the public recalibration of our story. Some society friends distanced themselves, unable to reconcile the woman they'd gossiped with at charity luncheons with the technical innovator now featured in business journals. But for every loss, there were unexpected gains. Young women in tech began reaching out, sharing how my story had inspired them to speak up in meetings, to demand credit for their work, to resist being sidelined into non-technical roles. Universities invited me to speak about imposter syndrome and the importance of maintaining professional identity within personal relationships. The Meridian Club, where I had spent countless afternoons discussing flower arrangements and fundraising themes, invited me to establish a women's entrepreneurship program. The same women who had once pitied me as poor Elena, just a housewife despite her education, now sought my advice on investment strategies and technology trends. Margaret Blackwood, the club's social chair who had once condescendingly called me Richard's better half, approached me after one of my tech talks. "I owe you an apology," she said. "We all do. We saw what we expected to see, not who you really were." "I showed you what I thought you wanted to see," I acknowledged. "We all played our assigned roles." 6 months after the revelation, Richard and I attended our first public event together since the truth emerged. The Tech Innovation Awards, The same ceremony where we'd been photographed as the perfect power couple the previous year had invited me to present the Women in Technology Award. As we prepared to leave, Richard watched me select my outfit. Instead of the gold Versace gown he would have chosen, I wore a sleek midnight blue pantsuit with a subtle circuit board pattern in the fabric, a gift from Sophie, who had discovered her mother's true history. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, "and brilliant." "I always was both," I replied. "You just forgot to see the second part." At the ceremony, the dynamics had shifted completely. People approached me first, discussing technical innovations and market strategies. Richard found himself introduced as Elena Mitchell's husband for the first time in our marriage. To his credit, he handled it with grace, though I caught him rubbing his wedding ring unconsciously, a nervous tell I recognized from our early days. During my presentation, I spoke about the importance of visible role models in technology. For 20 years, young women entering our industry didn't see me in technical leadership because I had been erased from my own story. Tonight, I want every woman in this room to know your contributions matter, your innovations deserve recognition, and your voice belongs in every technical discussion. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Richard joined in, and when our eyes met across the room, I saw something that had been missing for years: genuine respect. Later that night, as we drove home along Lakeshore Drive, Richard broke the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about our early days. Do you remember that algorithm you developed for predictive caching? The one that reduced processing time by 40%? Of course. You presented it to Intel as your breakthrough innovation." He winced. "I've been thinking we should correct that, publicly. Maybe a technical paper detailing the true development history of our core technologies." I studied his profile in the passing streetlights. "Why now?" "Because I'm tired of living with fiction," he admitted. "And because I want our children, and maybe someday our grandchildren, to know the truth about both their parents." It was a beginning, not a magical reconciliation that erased years of professional negation, but a genuine step toward rebuilding our relationship on authentic ground. We began working together again, not as CEO and trophy wife, but as the technical partners we had once been. The collaboration revealed how much we had both lost during the years of pretense. Richard had become isolated in his constructed narrative, surrounded by yes-men who never challenged his ideas. I had lost touch with the cutting edge of technology, my skills atrophying from disuse. Together, we began rebuilding what had been broken. Our first joint project in 2 decades was a complete overhaul of the company's AI ethics framework. As we worked late into the night, debating approaches and solving problems together, glimpses of our original partnership emerged. The intellectual electricity that had drawn us together still existed, stronger for having been rediscovered rather than assumed. "I forgot how your mind works," Richard said one evening as I elegantly solved a problem that had stumped the team for weeks. "It's like watching a master artist paint." "You used to call me your secret weapon," I reminded him. "You were never a weapon," he said quietly. "You were the arsenal. I just got too comfortable taking credit for your ammunition." The months following the revelation brought a steady stream of discoveries as we excavated the truth from beneath layers of convenient fiction. The company's founding mythology had to be completely rewritten. Press releases were corrected, Wikipedia entries updated, business school case studies revised. Harvard Business School, which had featured Richard as a solo entrepreneur in their curriculum, invited us both to discuss the reality of collaborative innovation and the dangers of erasing partners from success narratives. Standing before a lecture hall of MBA students, we dissected our own story as a cautionary tale. "The myth of the lone genius is seductive," I told the students. "It's a cleaner narrative than messy collaboration, but it's also dangerous. It erases contributions, stifles diverse perspectives, and ultimately weakens organizations." Richard added, I convinced myself I was protecting Elena from the harsh realities of business. In truth, I was protecting my ego from the reality that my success depended on her brilliance. A student raised her hand. Mrs. Mitchell, how do you rebuild trust after such a fundamental betrayal? I glanced at Richard before answering. You don't rebuild the old trust. You build something new based on truth rather than assumptions. It's harder work than the original foundation, but it's stronger for being consciously constructed. The Berkeley Innovation Forum invited me to keynote their annual conference, standing at the podium where tech luminaries had presented for decades. I spoke about the cost of invisibility in innovation. Every time we erase a contributor from the story of creation, we don't just wrong an individual. We deprive future innovators of role models, of proof that someone like them belongs in the room where it happens. The speech resonated beyond the tech community. Women in finance, medicine, academia, and other fields reached out with their own stories of professional erasure. The Preserving Truth movement evolved into a broader conversation about recognition, attribution, and the subtle ways success stories get simplified into single genius narratives. Sophie changed her major from business to computer science with a focus on AI ethics. I want to build on what you started, she told me during a weekend visit home. Not just the technology, but the integrity. We spent the afternoon in my home office reviewing code together for the first time. As I explained the elegance of certain algorithmic approaches, I saw my daughter seeing me fully for the first time, not as her father's wife or her mother, but as a technologist whose work had shaped an industry. Dad's giving a talk at Stanford next month, she mentioned casually, about entrepreneurship. I told him he should invite you to co-present. The real story is more interesting than the myth. The Stanford event became our first public joint presentation about the company's true origins. Standing on stage together, we told the unvarnished story. The late nights coding while pregnant, the arguments over technical approaches, the gradual shift from partnership to hierarchy, and the eventual reckoning that forced truth back into the light. During the Q&A, a young woman asked, Mr. Mitchell, what advice would you give to male entrepreneurs about partnering with women in tech? Richard paused before answering. See them. Really see them. Not as support systems or complementary skills, but as complete intellectuals whose contributions are as fundamental as your own. And when success comes, resist the temptation to simplify the story. Complex truth is always more valuable than convenient fiction. The applause that followed felt like absolution. Our home life gradually found a new equilibrium. Family dinners became forums for technical discussions where both children engaged with both parents as intellectual equals. Richard learned to ask for my input without condescension. I learned to offer it without defensiveness. One evening, as we reviewed quarterly projections together in the study that had once been his exclusive domain, Richard looked up from his laptop. Do you ever regret how it all came out? The public nature of it? I considered the question carefully. I regret that it took a crisis to restore truth. I regret the years we lost to pretense. But the revelation itself? No. Living authentically, even with its complications, is infinitely preferable to comfortable fiction. He nodded slowly. I'm starting to understand that. The board meeting tomorrow. I'd like you to present the AI initiative. It's your vision. You should be the one to articulate it. It was a small gesture, but significant. The man who had once taken credit for my innovations was learning to step back and let me shine. Not because he had to, but because he was beginning to want to. The company's transformation under shared leadership exceeded everyone's expectations. With my technical vision finally unleashed and Richard's business acumen properly directed, Mitchell Technologies entered a period of unprecedented innovation. Stock prices soared, employee satisfaction metrics improved, We were featured in case studies about the power of diverse leadership and authentic collaboration. Bloomberg returned for a follow-up interview a year after the initial revelation. Maria Santos opened with a direct question. Elena Mitchell, you've gone from invisible partner to visible leader. What's the biggest change you've noticed? Permission, I answered without hesitation. I've given myself permission to be fully present in my own life, and in doing so, I've apparently given other women permission to do the same. Every week, I hear from someone who demanded credit for their work, who spoke up in a meeting, who refused to be sidelined into a decorative role because they saw that it was possible to reclaim their narrative. And your relationship with your husband? Many predicted divorce after such a public reckoning. I smiled, glancing at Richard, who was watching from behind the cameras. We're rebuilding, not trying to recapture what we had before, but creating something new. It's harder than the original relationship because it requires conscious effort to see each other clearly. But it's also more genuine. We're partners again, in the truest sense. The interview concluded with footage of us working together in the R&D lab, debating approaches to quantum encryption protocols. The cameras captured what words couldn't fully convey. Two brilliant minds engaging as equals, the fiction of the past replaced by collaborative truth. That night, as we prepared for bed, Richard pulled out his phone to show me something. It was a draft press release announcing the Elena Mitchell Innovation Lab, a new R&D facility focused on quantum computing applications. I wanted your approval before sending this out, he said. It's time your name was on the building, not just buried in the paperwork. I read through the announcement, noting how it accurately detailed my early contributions to the company's core technologies. You're sure about this? It's a significant public statement. I'm sure, he said firmly. I've spent 2 decades taking credit for your brilliance. It's time to balance the scales. The lab opening 6 months later was attended by tech luminaries, academic researchers, and a surprising number of young women in STEM fields. As I cut the ribbon, I thought about the journey from erased partner to recognized innovator. The building bore my name, but more importantly, it represented the restoration of truth in our industry's historical narrative. Dr. Chen, my old professor, attended the ceremony. Now in his 80s but still sharp, he pulled me aside during the reception. I always knew you'd change the world, he said. I just didn't expect you to have to do it twice, once with your innovations, and again, by reclaiming credit for them. The second time might be more important, I reflected. Technology advances regardless of who gets credit. But changing how we recognize contribution, that reshapes the entire landscape of innovation. As the sun set over Chicago's skyline, illuminating the letters of my name on the new building, I realized that my story had become larger than personal vindication. It was about the imperative of truth in an industry built on innovation, about the danger of simplified narratives in complex collaborations, and about the power of reclaiming one's authentic identity even after decades of erasure. The trophy, wife label that had followed me through countless social events had been replaced by a new understanding, not just in society's perception of me, but in my own self-concept. I was Elena Mitchell, engineer, innovator, entrepreneur, mother, wife, and finally, unapologetically, myself. The shattered champagne flute from that fateful gala had indeed marked an ending, the death of a convenient fiction. But from those glittering shards had emerged something far more valuable, a truth that couldn't be contained, a voice that refused to be silenced, and a legacy built on authentic contribution rather than decorative compliance. The woman who had once been content to be seen as just a trophy wife now stood as proof that brilliance cannot be permanently dimmed, that truth eventually surfaces, and that it's never too late to reclaim your own story. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown office, illuminating the skyline of Chicago in a soft golden glow. On my desk sat a stack of documents, the final paperwork for an acquisition that would cement Mitchell Technology's position as an industry leader in quantum encryption. It was the kind of deal Richard would have handled alone 2 years ago, presenting me with the completed transaction as a fait accompli over dinner. Now, my signature was required alongside his, not as a formality, but as the acknowledged co-owner and chairwoman of the company. I traced my fingers over the embossed company letterhead, noting how the logo had subtly changed in recent months. The stylized M had been redesigned to incorporate elements of both our initials, an elegant visual representation of the truth finally made visible. These small markers of change sometimes affected me more deeply than the major public revelations had. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Diane Chen, our COO, who had replaced Victoria, entered with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing smile. "Board meeting in 20 minutes. Thought you might need reinforcements." She placed 1 cup on my desk, noting the acquisition papers. "Big day." "Transformative," I agreed, accepting the coffee gratefully. Quantum Rivers has the most advanced post-quantum cryptography research team in the industry. With their patents combined with our infrastructure, we'll be years ahead of the competition, Diane finished, settling into the chair opposite me. "And I've reviewed the integration plan. The way you've structured leadership ensures their research team maintains creative control while accessing our resources. They're getting a better deal than most acquisitions." "Because we remember what it's like to lose control of your own creation," I replied. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I had gone from being erased from my company's narrative to leading its most significant expansion in 2 decades. "The board will approve unanimously," Diane assured me. "Even Maxwell has come around. He told me yesterday that your technical vision has exceeded expectations." She mimicked his pompous tone perfectly. I laughed, remembering the elderly board member's initial resistance to my leadership. Maxwell Sterling had been Richard's golf buddy for 15 years, one of the old guard who had watched me transition from technical co-founder to decorative wife without comment. His recent conversion to supporter felt like a personal victory. "Speaking of conversions," Diane continued, checking her phone, "the Women in STEM Mentorship Program has received another major donation. We're now funded for the next 5 years." The program had been my first initiative after reclaiming my position. Partnering with universities across the Midwest, we identified young women with technical promise and paired them with industry leaders for guidance, internships, and financial support. What had started as a small personal project had grown into one of the company's most visible social impact programs. "That's excellent news," I said, gathering the acquisition papers into my briefcase. "Who's the donor?" Diane's smile widened. "Richard." The revelation surprised me. Richard had supported the program publicly, of course, appearing at events and speaking about the importance of gender equity in tech. But this substantial personal donation, separate from company funds, suggested something deeper than public relations. "He didn't mention it," I said carefully. "He requested anonymity," Diane explained. "Said the program should be associated with your name, not his. I only know because I handle the foundation paperwork." The gesture touched me in unexpected ways. Richard's journey over the past 2 years had been complicated. From defensive denial to reluctant acknowledgement to genuine reckoning. His public apologies and course corrections had seemed sincere enough, but this private action spoke to something more profound, a recognition that some imbalances required more than words to correct. As we walked to the boardroom, I noticed the subtle changes that had transformed our corporate headquarters since my return to leadership. The corridor walls, once lined exclusively with photos of Richard at industry events, now displayed a more inclusive visual history. There was Richard, certainly, but also teams of engineers, researchers, and notably, historical photos of our early days, including several showing me at my computer, coding the algorithms that became our flagship products. The board meeting proceeded as Diane had predicted. The Quantum Rivers acquisition was approved unanimously, with even Maxwell offering enthusiastic support. Elena's technical assessment of their quantum encryption protocols convinced me, he announced to the EI room. Her vision for integration is sound. 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, such a statement would have been unimaginable. My vision had been something Richard presented as his own. My technical assessments filtered through his perspective, my analyses attributed to unnamed team members. The simple pleasure of being recognized for my expertise still hadn't lost its novelty. After the meeting, Richard lingered as other board members filed out. "Dinner tonight?" he suggested. "To celebrate the acquisition?" "I'd love to," I replied, but I promised Sophie I'd video chat about her thesis proposal. She's decided to focus on ethical applications of quantum computing. "I know," Richard said with a smile. "She called me for background on our early quantum projects. I gave her your original research notes, told her to go to the source." Another small marker of change. Richard referring Sophie to me for technical history rather than positioning himself as the sole authority. These moments still caught me by surprise. Evidence of genuine evolution rather than strategic adaptation. "Join us for the call," I offered, impulsively. "She'd appreciate your input on the commercial viability angles." Richard's expression brightened. "Really? I'd like that. 7 o'clock?" 7 works perfectly. As I watched him walk away, I reflected on the careful reconstruction of our relationship over the past 2 years. After the initial revelation of my ownership and the public reckoning that followed, we had existed in a state of cautious negotiation. Legally still married, practically operating as business partners with separate personal lives. The home we had shared for decades suddenly felt like contested territory, leading me to lease the downtown apartment where I now spent most weeknights. Weekends still found us in the Belmont Heights mansion, maintaining family traditions with Lucas and Sophie when they visited from college. These arrangements had evolved organically, without formal discussion of separation or divorce. Neither of us had been ready to make permanent decisions while the ground beneath us continued to shift. I returned to my office to find an email from Dr. James Chen, my former professor and mentor who had inadvertently sparked the revelation by inviting me to speak at the Northwestern alumni event. Now in his 80s, he remained actively engaged in both academic research and the ongoing conversation about women in technology. "Elena," his message read, "I'm finalizing my book on hidden figures in computing. Your story occupies the final chapter, Reclamation. Would you be willing to review for accuracy and perhaps write a brief foreword? The narrative of your journey from erasure to acknowledgement provides the perfect conclusion to a history of women who changed an industry without recognition." I replied immediately, agreeing to both requests. Dr. Chen's book represented a broader movement that had gained momentum since my story became public. The excavation of computing history to restore overlooked contributors to their rightful place. What had begun as my personal reclamation had amplified into something larger, giving others permission to demand similar recognition. My assistant interrupted with a reminder about my afternoon appointment at the Elena Kovach Innovation Lab. The facility, opened 6 months earlier in a renovated warehouse near the university, had quickly become the crown jewel of our research division. Unlike traditional corporate labs with their hierarchy and secrecy, the Kovach Lab operated on principles of open collaboration, transparent attribution, and diverse leadership. I arrived to find the main workspace buzzing with activity. Graduate. Students worked alongside senior engineers. Their projects displayed on digital boards with clear attribution for each contributor. The absence of private offices and closed-door meetings had initially raised concerns about intellectual property protection, but we'd developed new models that balanced openness with appropriate safeguards. Priya Patel, the young engineer I had mentored through her early crisis of confidence, now led the quantum encryption team. She greeted me with a tablet displaying their latest results. "We've achieved stable entanglement at room temperature," she announced proudly. "The protocols you suggested last month were the breakthrough." I reviewed the data with growing excitement. "This is revolutionary, Priya. How soon can we incorporate this into the Quantum Rivers integration?" "That's actually why I asked to meet today," she replied, leading me to a conference area where several researchers waited. "We've developed an implementation strategy that would accelerate deployment by approximately 8 months. For the next 2 hours, I immersed myself in technical discussions that would have been unimaginable during my years as the decorative Mrs. Mitchell. The team treated me not as the boss's wife, or even as the company chairwoman, but as a technical peer whose expertise they valued. When I suggested modifications to their approach, they engaged critically, challenging assumptions and refining concepts collaboratively. As the meeting concluded, Priya walked me to the lab entrance. "I've been meaning to thank you," she said. "Not just for the mentorship, but for everything you've done to change the culture. When I started in this industry, I watched women's ideas get appropriated in real time. Now, at least in our company, that's becoming unthinkable." "The culture change is still fragile," I cautioned. "It requires constant vigilance." "Which is why we're documenting everything," she said with a knowing smile. "Every breakthrough, every contribution, every insight, all with clear attribution. We learned from your experience." Outside, Chicago's late afternoon traffic hummed as my driver navigated toward the downtown apartment I now called home most weekdays. The space had become a physical manifestation of my reclaimed identity. Filled with technical books I had hidden away for years, artwork I had selected without consideration for Richard's preferences, and most importantly, a home office designed around my work patterns rather than aesthetic considerations. I had just enough time to prepare for the video call with Sophie. As I changed from business attire to comfortable loungewear, I caught sight of my reflection in the bedroom mirror. At 54, I looked different than I had 2 years ago. The carefully maintained blonde highlights that Richard had preferred had grown out, revealing natural silver streaks that I now wore with confidence. The designer clothes selected to project CEO's wife had been replaced with pieces chosen for my own comfort and taste. Even my posture had changed, more upright, more present, less concerned with being decorative. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Bringing dinner for our call with Sophie. Your favorite from Gino's. That still okay?" The small consideration touched me. "Perfect. See you at 7, I replied. Richard arrived precisely on time, bearing containers of pasta from the Italian restaurant we had frequented during our early days building the company. Before Sophie called, we arranged the food on my dining table, moving with the awkward choreography of former intimates rediscovering boundaries. "I heard about your donation to the mentorship program," I said as we settled at the table. "That was incredibly generous." Richard looked momentarily surprised, then resigned. "Diane told you?" She had to process the paperwork. Why the anonymity? He considered the question while serving pasta. "Because it's not about me. My public support is necessary. Men in my position need to visibly champion these initiatives. But my private contribution needed to be just that. Private. A recognition that some debts can't be repaid with public gestures." Before I could respond, my laptop chimed with Sophie's incoming call. Her face appeared on screen, her expression brightening when she saw us both. "Dad, Mom didn't mention you'd be joining." "Last-minute addition," Richard explained. "I hear you're diving into quantum ethics for your thesis." Sophie launched enthusiastically into her research proposal, outlining how quantum computing's unprecedented powers would require new ethical frameworks. "Conventional encryption will be obsolete," she explained. "Financial systems, personal data, national security, everything protected by current methods becomes vulnerable. Who controls that power? How do we ensure equitable access while preventing misuse? I watched her with pride that transcended the typical parental variety. Sophie had inherited both our technical aptitudes, but she approached technology with a moral framework that surpassed either of us at her age. While Richard and I had been focused on what could be built, Sophie's generation asked what should be built. "I've been reviewing your early quantum papers, Mom," Sophie continued. "Your concerns about potential security implications were prescient, especially considering how rudimentary the technology was then. But almost nobody cited your work in subsequent research." "Because it was buried," Richard interjected quietly. "After I presented at the Quantum Futures Conference under only my name, your mother's foundational research became attributed to me in all subsequent citations." His candid acknowledgement hung in the virtual space between us. 2 years ago, he would have glossed over this history, reframing it as a joint decision or a marketing strategy. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Which is why I'm citing her original papers extensively in my literature review. Correcting the record." After discussing methodological approaches and potential faculty advisors, Sophie signed off with promises to send us draft sections as she progressed. When the screen went dark, Richard and I sat in contemplative silence, the remnants of dinner between us. "She's brilliant," Richard finally said. "Smarter than either of us." "And more ethically grounded," I added. "We were so focused on creating that we didn't always consider implications." "You did," he corrected. "Those security concerns in your early papers. You were raising ethical questions when the rest of us just saw market opportunities." Another contribution that got minimized. The acknowledgement warmed me unexpectedly. These retrospective recognitions still carried significant weight, especially when freely offered rather than extracted under pressure. "I've been meeting with a biographer," Richard said suddenly, the abrupt topic change catching me off guard, "to document the true history of Mitchell Technologies. My role, your role, the gradual erasure, all of it. I want it on record while memories are still fresh." "A public mea culpa?" I asked, trying to understand his motivation. "More like a corrective history." The company narrative was distorted for years. The simplification served my ego but damaged innovation culture throughout the industry. Young technologists deserve the true story, not just about us specifically, but about how these exclusionary patterns operate systemically. His sincerity was evident, but something about the project troubled me. Why not write it together? Why work with a biographer separately? "Because my perspective needs examination by an objective third party," he explained. "My recollections are shaped by self-interest, even now." The biographer is interviewing dozens of people from our history, early employees, investors, competitors, building a comprehensive picture that doesn't center my narrative. The approach surprised me with its thoughtfulness. The Richard of 3 years ago would have controlled the story tightly, ensuring he emerged as the protagonist even in a narrative about mistakes. This willingness to subject his perspective to external scrutiny represented genuine growth. "I think it's important work," I said finally. "And I'd be willing to contribute my perspective. But I'd want to review the manuscript before publication." "Of course, that's essential." He began gathering the dinner containers, pausing to add, "There's something else I've been wanting to discuss. The house." The Belmont Heights mansion had become an increasingly awkward shared space. Though we maintained separate bedrooms, the home contained 30 years of married life, memories embedded in every room, habits formed around each other's presence. Neither of us had been willing to suggest selling it while the children were still returning for holidays and summer breaks. "What about it?" I asked cautiously. "I think we should consider selling," he said. "It represents a chapter that's closed. We're not those people anymore. And maintaining the pretense of a conventional marriage doesn't serve either of us." His directness was both startling and refreshing. "You want a divorce?" The question emerged more calmly than I might have expected a year earlier. "I want clarity," he corrected, "for ourselves and others. We've built something new, a functional partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. But it's not a marriage in any traditional sense." He was right. Since the revelation, our relationship had evolved into something unique, more substantial than many marriages. In terms of collaborative purpose, less intimate in terms of emotional connection. We worked well together now, perhaps better than we had in decades, precisely because we had stopped pretending to be conventional spouses. "I'll think about it," I promised. "It's a significant step." After Richard left, I found myself drawn to the balcony of my apartment, gazing out at the Chicago skyline. The lights of downtown buildings created a tapestry of illumination against the night sky. Somewhere among those lights was Mitchell Technologies' headquarters, the Elena Mitchell Innovation Lab, Northwestern University, where it had all begun. The conversation about divorce, strangely, hadn't filled me with sadness or regret. Instead, I felt a curious sense of possibility, like a project reaching a natural evolutionary stage. Richard and I had created a company together, raised children together, and now were collaboratively correcting the historical record together. The legal dissolution of our marriage seemed almost irrelevant to the complex bond we had formed. My phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line immediately caught my attention. "SEC investigation closed. No further action." Our legal team had forwarded the official notice, confirming that the Securities and Exchange Commission had concluded its examination of Mitchell Technologies' ownership structure and historical filings. The investigation that had inadvertently forced my hand 2 years ago was finally over, with no penalties or sanctions against the company. The timing seemed fitting, one chapter conclusively ending as we contemplated closing another. The email included a personal note from our lead counsel. "Congratulations, Elena. Your meticulous documentation saved not just your rightful position, but the entire company from potential fraud charges. A powerful lesson in preserving truth." I smiled at the phrase that had become something of a personal motto: preserving truth. It had started as a defensive mechanism, maintaining records to protect myself when no one else would, but had evolved into a guiding principle for both personal conduct and corporate culture. The following morning, I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual, drawn by a strange restlessness. The building was quiet, most employees not due for another hour. I found myself wandering to the company museum on the ground floor, a space that had once showcased Richard's journey as a tech visionary, but had been extensively revamped since my return to leadership. The displays now told a more complete story. Early photos showed both of us working in our first apartment, my pregnant form hunched over primitive computers, Richard pitching to potential investors. Patents displayed on the wall listed both our names. Prototype devices were accompanied by developmental timelines that credited the entire team responsible for each innovation. I paused at a new addition, a small display case containing what appeared to be a bundle of old notebooks. The accompanying placard read, "Elena Kovac's Original Algorithm Notebooks, 1993-1998. These handwritten notes contain the foundational code that would become Mitchell Technologies' core products. Preserved by Elena throughout decades of corporate evolution, these documents ultimately helped correct the historical record of the company's creation. The notebooks had been my private insurance policy, evidence of my contributions kept hidden for years. Now they were displayed as historical artifacts, their existence acknowledged as central to the company's origin story. The irony was powerful. What I had preserved in secrecy was now preserved in public memory. "They arrived yesterday," a voice said behind me. I turned to find Marcus Wright, my attorney and friend who had helped me navigate the initial revelation. "I helped the museum curator with the provenance documentation. We wanted to surprise you." "They look strange behind glass," I admitted. "They were just work tools to me, never meant to be historical objects." "History is made by those who keep receipts," Marcus observed with a smile. When we originally reviewed these notebooks, I knew they would change the company's trajectory. I didn't anticipate they would become cultural artifacts. As employees began arriving for the day, several stopped to view the new exhibit, nodding respectfully in my direction. The awkwardness that had characterized the early days after my revelation, staff uncertain how to adjust to my transformed role, had gradually given way to a comfortable acknowledgement. I was no longer Richard's wife who mysteriously gained power, but a founder reclaiming her rightful position. My morning calendar included a meeting with an unexpected visitor, Victoria Hammond, Richard's former COO who had resigned shortly after my return to leadership. Her departure had been acrimonious, her loyalty to Richard's version of history, making it impossible for her to adapt to the corrected narrative. Her request for a meeting had surprised me enough that I had agreed out of curiosity. Victoria arrived, precisely on time, her appearance as meticulously constructed as ever. Designer suit, perfect makeup, not a hair out of place. She had always been the polished executive to my decorative wife at company functions. The reversal of our positions clearly still unsettled her. "Thank you for seeing me," she began formally as we settled in my office. "I recognize this isn't a comfortable situation for either of us." "What can I do for you, Victoria?" I asked directly. We had never had the kind of relationship that warranted pleasantries. She straightened almost imperceptibly. "I've been developing a startup focused on AI applications in medical diagnostics. We're seeking strategic partnerships. Mitchell Technologies, specifically the Kovac Lab, is doing complementary work in quantum processing for complex protein modeling." The request was unexpected. Victoria had left declaring she would build something to rival Mitchell Technologies, not seek partnership. "With us, you have access to other quantum computing resources," I observed. "Why approach us?" "Because your team is the best," she admitted with visible difficulty. "Specifically, the attribution protocols you've implemented have attracted top research talent. No one's afraid their work will be claimed by others." The acknowledgement was significant, coming from someone who had previously dismissed my concerns about proper credit as academic fussiness, inappropriate for the business world. Victoria had been Richard's most loyal defender, often running interference when questions arose about his solo technical credentials. "That's quite a shift in perspective," I noted. Victoria sighed, her composure cracking slightly. "The past 2 years have been educational. After leaving here, I tried to replicate Richard's leadership style at my startup. I claimed credit for my team's innovations, positioned myself as the visionary while treating technical contributors as interchangeable resources. It created a toxic culture almost immediately. Top talent left. Productivity collapsed. And now you're reconsidering that approach," I surmised. "I had to," she said simply. "The business was failing. So I studied what you've built here since taking control. The attribution protocols, the collaborative leadership model, the transparent decision-making. It's creating better results than our old command and control structure ever did." The admission clearly cost her considerable pride. Victoria had been my most vocal critic during the transition, often suggesting publicly that the company would falter without Richard's singular vision at the helm. Our market performance since then, stock price up 78%, new patent filings increased by 43%, staff retention improved dramatically, had proven otherwise. "I'm still learning," I acknowledged. "The systems we're building aren't perfect, but they're more sustainable than what existed before." "Which is why I'd like to explore partnership opportunities," Victoria concluded. "My medical AI algorithms combined with your quantum processing could revolutionize early cancer detection. And I'd benefit from your guidance on building ethical attribution systems." The humility of the request was extraordinary, coming from a woman who had once dismissed me as Richard's decorative distraction within earshot at a board dinner. Part of me wanted to savor the reversal, but a larger part recognized the importance. of the work she described. "Send me your technical specifications and partnership proposal," I agreed. "I'll review them personally and connect you with our healthcare division director if there's alignment. As for attribution systems, I'm giving a workshop on exactly that topic next month at the Chicago Tech Summit. You'd be welcome to attend." Relief washed visibly across Victoria's carefully maintained facade. "Thank you. That's more than I expected given our history." "History evolves when we allow new evidence to shape our understanding," I replied, thinking of the notebooks now displayed in the company museum. That applies to professional relationships as much as company. Narratives. After Victoria left, I found myself reflecting on how thoroughly the ripple effects of my reclamation had spread. Former executives reconsidering leadership approaches, young engineers learning to protect their contributions, even competitors adopting our attribution models as industry best practices. My afternoon schedule included a virtual meeting with the Advisory Committee for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Following my initial involvement with their Equity and Innovation Initiative, I had been appointed to a task force focused on attribution standards for federally funded research. The group included academic leaders, industry representatives, and policy experts working to develop guidelines that would prevent the kind of erasure I had experienced. "The draft standards are ready for broader consultation," announced Dr. Yind. "Maya Williams, the committee chair. Elena, the section on collaborative attribution that you developed has received particularly positive feedback during preliminary reviews." "That's encouraging," I replied. "Have we addressed the concerns about implementation complexity? Some research teams worried that documenting individual contributions would create administrative burdens. We've developed simplified tools based on the protocols you implemented at Mitchell Technologies," Dr. Williams explained. "The focus is on making attribution routine rather than exceptional, building it into the research process rather than adding it as an afterthought." The conversation continued, addressing nuances of implementation across different disciplines and institutional contexts. What struck me most was how readily these distinguished experts incorporated my input, a dramatic contrast to the years when my technical perspective had been filtered through Richard's presentation or dismissed entirely. The change wasn't just in how others perceived me, but in how I offered my contributions, directly, confidently, without the self-diminishment I had practiced for decades. After the call concluded, my assistant reminded me of the evening's commitment, a dinner with Diane and key members of the Quantum Rivers acquisition team. As I prepared to leave, Richard appeared in my doorway, a familiar manila envelope in his hand. "Final divorce papers," he said without preamble. "Just delivered from the attorneys. Thought you might want to review them before the weekend." We had decided to proceed with the divorce 2 weeks after our conversation over pasta in my apartment. The process had been remarkably amicable. No disputes over assets, no contested terms, no emotional recriminations. We had constructed a dissolution agreement that acknowledged our continuing business partnership while formally ending our marriage. "Thank you," I said, accepting the envelope. "I'll review them tonight and let you know if I have any questions." Richard lingered in the doorway. "Are you attending the Technology Pioneer Awards next week? They've nominated you in the Innovation Leadership category." "I've submitted my RSVP," I confirmed. "Will you be there?" "Yes, though I wasn't nominated this year." He said this without resentment, simply stating fact. First time in 15 years I haven't been on the ballot. Recognition cycles change, I observed. When they understand that innovation is collaborative, they start acknowledging different contributors. "As they should," he agreed. "Besides, I've had plenty of time in the spotlight. More than my fair share, actually." This graceful acceptance of reduced public adulation was perhaps the most profound evidence of Richard's evolution. The man, who had carefully cultivated his image as a singular tech visionary, now seemed comfortable with a redefined role that acknowledged the collaborative nature of innovation. "Will you be bringing anyone to the ceremony?" he asked casually, though something in his tone suggested the question wasn't entirely neutral. "No," I replied. "I considered asking James Chen to accompany me, but he's presenting at a conference in Singapore that week." "Why do you ask?" Richard shrugged. "Just planning navigational logistics. These events can be awkward when former spouses are both attending." The pragmatic consideration was characteristic of our new relationship. Reasonable, practical, focused on functioning effectively rather than emotional entanglements. Yet something about his careful neutrality suggested unspoken dimensions. After he left, I slipped the divorce papers into my briefcase, oddly untroubled by their presence. Our marriage had ended in practical terms 2 years ago. The legal dissolution merely formalized a transition already accomplished. The dinner with the Quantum Rivers team proved illuminating. Their lead researchers, initially cautious about being acquired, expressed genuine enthusiasm about joining our company after touring the Kovacs lab and reviewing our attribution protocols. "We've had acquisition offers before," explained Dr. Renata Schultz, their quantum theory specialist. "But most would have buried our research team within corporate hierarchies. Your model preserves our identity while providing resources we couldn't access independently." "That preservation matters," I acknowledged. "When contributions become invisible, innovation suffers." We learned that lesson the hard way. The conversation shifted to integration timelines and research priorities, but Dr. Schultz's observation lingered with me. Preservation of identity within larger structures had become a central theme of my leadership approach, ensuring that individuals remained visible even as they contributed to collective achievements. The following day brought an unexpected invitation. Northwestern University was establishing the Elena Kovacs Center for Women in Technology, endowed by anonymous donors to support research, scholarships, and mentorship programs. They requested my participation in the foundation, committee, and permission to use my name. "This feels premature," I told Dr. Chen when I called to discuss the invitation. "My story isn't finished yet. Legacy institutions aren't based on completed narratives," he reminded me. "They're established when someone's impact reaches a critical threshold. Your reclamation has already changed how an entire generation of young women perceives their place in technology. That merits recognition regardless of what comes next." "I'm concerned about sending the wrong message," I admitted. "That women must be extraordinary to deserve basic professional recognition." "Then help shape the center's mission to address exactly that concern," he suggested. "Make it about systemic change, not exceptional individuals. Use the platform to advocate for the ordinary dignity of attribution that should be available to everyone." His reframing resonated with me. Perhaps the center could serve as a vehicle for institutional change rather than personal commemoration. "I'll meet with the foundation committee," I decided. "But I want to be directly involved in shaping the mission and programming. This can't be just a naming opportunity." That weekend, I visited the Belmont Heights house to continue the gradual process of separating our belongings. With the divorce papers under review and the property listed for sale, we had begun the practical work of untangling 30 years of shared life. Richard was attending a conference in Boston, leaving me alone to sort through my office and personal items. The process was less emotional than I had anticipated. The home had already become a museum of our former life, rather than a living space, maintained for appearances and occasional family gatherings, rather than daily existence. My downtown apartment felt more authentically mine than this carefully decorated showcase had in years. As I sorted through bookshelves, separating technical volumes I wanted to keep from decorative books selected by interior designers, I discovered a handwritten letter tucked between pages of a rarely opened photography collection. The envelope was addressed simply, "Elena," in Richard's distinctive handwriting. The date at the top of the letter stopped me cold. It had been Written just days after our confrontation 2 years ago, when the truth of my ownership had been revealed. Elena, it began. I'm writing this knowing I may never have the courage to give it to you. The past 48 hours have shattered everything I believed about our life together. Not because you own the company, though that revelation was seismic, but because I finally see how thoroughly I erased you from your own creation. I've spent today reviewing your old technical journals, the patent applications with your name later removed, the early press where you were still acknowledged as co-creator. The evidence of my systematic erasure of your contributions is undeniable and damning. What began as convenient simplification for marketing purposes evolved into a complete rewriting of history that I eventually came to believe myself. The worst realization is that I didn't do this with conscious malice. I did it with the casual entitlement of someone who never questioned his right to occupy center stage. Each step seemed reasonable at the time, streamlining the company narrative, focusing press attention, simplifying our public image. But the cumulative effect was to remove you from your own life's work. I have no right to ask forgiveness, but I need you to know that I see it now. All of it. The magnitude of what I took from you cannot be calculated. Whether our marriage survives this reckoning is secondary to the professional restoration you deserve. Whatever public or private acknowledgement you require, I will provide without hesitation. With profound regret and belated recognition, Richard. The letter had never been delivered. Instead, it had been hidden in a book I never opened, perhaps placed there in a moment of vulnerability and then abandoned when courage failed. Finding it now, 2 years into our redefined relationship, felt like discovering an artifact from a different timeline. One where Richard's recognition had come from internal reckoning rather than external pressure. I carefully returned the letter to its envelope, uncertain how to feel about this glimpse into Richard's private thoughts during that turbulent period. The sentiments aligned with changes he had eventually implemented, but the immediacy of his remorse contradicted the defensive posture he had maintained publicly for months afterward. Perhaps he had needed time to align his private recognitions with public actions, or perhaps the letter represented aspirations he couldn't immediately fulfill. My phone interrupted these reflections, a text from Sophie asking about my availability for brunch the following weekend. Lucas will be home too, she added. We want to talk to you and Dad about something important. The cryptic message prompted immediate parental concern. I texted back confirming my availability, then forwarded the message to Richard with a note. Any ideas what this is about? His response came quickly. None. Should we be worried? Probably not, I replied, but I'll reschedule anything else to be there. After finishing my sorting for the day, I drove back to my apartment with boxes of books and personal mementos. The divorce papers sat on my dining table where I had left them after initial review. The terms were exactly as we had discussed. Equitable division of personal assets, continued shared ownership of the company with clear governance protocols, maintenance of both our names on relevant patents and intellectual property. What struck me most as I reviewed the documents again was how different this dissolution felt from what might have occurred had we separated before the truth emerged. In that alternative timeline, I would have been positioned as the decorative wife receiving generous settlement from the brilliant founder. The power dynamic would have remained unchallenged, the historical record uncorrected. Instead, we were separating as equals, business partners who had created significant value together and would continue collaborative leadership while acknowledging that our personal relationship had fundamentally changed. The divorce wasn't about grievance or fault, but about authentic recognition of what our relationship had become. I signed the papers with a strange sense of resolution rather than loss. The marriage being legally dissolved had effectively ended years ago when Richard began systematically removing me from our shared narrative. What remained now was more honest than what had existed before. Partnership based on mutual recognition rather than hierarchical erasure. The following week brought the Technology Pioneer Awards, held at the Chicago Symphony Center. The elegant venue filled with technology leaders, investors, and media representatives. As a nominee, I was seated near the front, at a table separate from Richard's. The physical distance between us at an event we would once have attended as a carefully coordinated couple felt appropriate to our new reality. When my category was announced, Innovation Leadership, the video presentation highlighted the attribution protocols I had implemented at Mitchell Technologies, the Elena Innovation Lab's collaborative research model, and my policy work with federal agencies. When my name was announced as the winner, the applause startled me with its enthusiasm. I made my way to the stage feeling a profound sense of symmetry. This was the same podium where I had stood silently beside Richard many times as he accepted accolades for innovations we had created together. Now I ascended those stairs alone, my contributions acknowledged in their own right. "Thank you," I began, accepting the Crystal Award. "This recognition belongs not just to me, but to every contributor whose ideas have been subsumed into someone else's narrative." Innovation is rarely solitary, despite the stories we tell ourselves about lone geniuses. True leadership isn't about claiming the spotlight. It's about ensuring everyone's light can shine. As I spoke, I caught Richard's eye in the audience. He nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no interpretation. We had traveled a long journey from the days when he would unconsciously position himself in front of me in photographs, physically manifesting the professional erasure happening in our company. The reception afterwards buzzed with conversation about the future of collaborative innovation. Young entrepreneurs sought my advice on building attribution systems from the ground up, rather than correcting them retrospectively. Several tech journalists requested interviews for features on the changing culture of innovation recognition. What had begun as my personal reclamation had evolved into a broader conversation about structural reform. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone on the Symphony Center's terrace, the Chicago skyline creating a stunning backdrop. Richard appeared beside me, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "Congratulations," he said, offering one to me. "The award is well-deserved." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the glass. "It feels like a milestone in a journey that's still unfolding." "I signed the divorce papers this morning," he said after a moment of companionable silence. "The courier should have delivered them to your attorney by now." The information settled between us without drama or tension. "So we're officially transitioning to the next phase," I observed. "Partners, but not spouses," he nodded. "It suits who we've become." We clinked glasses in a toast that felt more like celebration than mourning. The divorce formalized a truth we had both accepted. Our relationship had transformed into something neither of us had anticipated, but which served our current selves better than the fiction we had maintained for years. The brunch with Sophie and Lucas that weekend revealed their important news. They had established a foundation using portions of their trust funds to support technology education for girls from immigrant backgrounds. "We're calling it the Kovach Foundation," Sophie explained as we sat in my apartment's dining room, "to honor Grandma and Grandpa's journey and your path from their immigrant sacrifice to technological innovation." "You don't mind that we're using your maiden name, do you?" Lucas asked, looking between Richard and me. "We wanted to highlight that specific part of our heritage." "I think it's perfect," Richard said before I could respond. "The immigrant journey is as important to our family story as the technical innovations. Both deserve recognition." His gracious acknowledgement of my heritage as central to our family narrative touched me deeply. The Richard of 5 years ago would have subtly redirected attention to the Mitchell legacy rather than centering the Kovach contribution. As our children outlined their plans for scholarship programs and mentorship initiatives, I felt a profound sense of completion. The truth I had fought to preserve wasn't just changing my life or even the technology industry. It was shaping how the next generation understood their own history and values. When Richard and I were alone after the children left, he handed me a small package. "I found this while clearing out the home office," he explained. Inside was a flash drive labeled in my handwriting, "Original Encryption Algorithms, 1994. I remembered creating the backup but had assumed it was lost decades ago during one of our many office reorganizations. "I thought it should be preserved in the company archives," Richard said. "Or perhaps displayed alongside your notebooks in the museum. It's part of the origin story that shouldn't be lost again." The gesture was small but meaningful. Another piece of my contribution being restored to the historical record. "Thank you," I said simply. "I'll make sure it's properly archived." 6 months later, I stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Elena Center for Women in Technology at Northwestern University. The sleek building housed research facilities, classrooms, and innovation labs designed to support women pursuing technology careers. More importantly, it incorporated structural safeguards against the very erasure I had experienced. Attribution protocols, collaborative leadership models, and mentorship programs designed to ensure visibility. Richard attended the ceremony, not as my husband, but as a corporate sponsor, his presence appropriate to our new relationship as business partners with shared values but separate lives. The signed divorce papers had finally been filed 3 months earlier, with minimal public attention and no disruption to our professional collaboration. As I addressed the gathered students, faculty, and technology leaders, I saw my life coming, full circle. "This center stands as both a celebration and a caution," I concluded. "A celebration of what becomes possible when all contributors are recognized, and a caution against the subtle erasures that diminish innovation. May the work done within these walls always honor the full truth of creation." Later, walking across the campus where my journey had begun decades earlier, I reflected on how thoroughly my reclamation had transformed into something larger than personal vindication. The trophy wife label that had once defined me had been replaced by a legacy built on truth, resilience, and the power of preserved records. My mother's words on my wedding day echoed in my memory. "A woman who forgets her own strength becomes weak." I had remembered mine, and in doing so, had perhaps helped others find theirs. The elegant crystal award from the Technology Pioneer ceremony now sat on my office desk, alongside a framed photo taken at the Kovacs Center opening, showing me flanked by Sophie and Lucas, 3 generations of innovators connected by blood and vision. The journey from erasure to acknowledgement had been arduous, but as I looked toward the future, I felt only the lightness of authentic existence. No longer anyone's trophy, but fully my own creation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.